Have you ever felt the sensation of being watched? Today, we're going to explore the darker side of this fear with 7 chilling horror stories about stalkers and stalking, all based on real accounts. Get ready to immerse yourself in situations that will leave your nerves on edge. And before we start, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any scary content like this. Now turn off the lights and let's go. 1. The Voice in the Dark. It was a cold night in Edinburgh, Scotland. The wind howled through the narrow streets of the old city, and the fine rain beat against the windows of Emily's small apartment. She had recently moved in, looking for a fresh start after a difficult breakup and a turbulent few months. At 27, Emily was a reserved young woman with a passion for literature and coffee. She spent her evenings reading the classics by the light of a yellow lamp, while the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. The city seemed like the perfect refuge, quiet, historic, and full of charm. That evening, as he settled on the sofa with his favorite cup, a blue mug with little star designs, his cell phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. "You've just picked up your favorite cup of coffee." Emily frowned. It was strange, but not impossible that someone knew about this. Perhaps it was a joke from a close friend or even a mistake. She replied with a simple, "Who is it?" but got no response. The next day, while she was preparing breakfast, another message arrived. "Toast with strawberry jam today?" Interesting choice. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. Whoever it was seemed to be watching her. Trying to keep calm, she checked the windows and doors of the apartment. Everything was locked. Maybe it was a coincidence, she thought. The messages continued over the next few days, always describing her actions in real time. "I like the red dress you chose for today." Or, "The chapter you read yesterday is really exciting." At first she tried to ignore it, but it wasn't long before the paranoia began to take hold of her. She closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and avoided going out at night. But none of this seemed to stop the messages. One night, while she was trying to sleep, her cell phone vibrated again. She hesitated before looking at the screen. The message read, "You look so peaceful sleeping." Her heart raced. She looked around the dark room, feeling exposed and vulnerable. How could anyone know about this? Could there be hidden cameras? Could someone have been inside the apartment? She took a knife from the kitchen and inspected every corner of the place, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Determined to solve the mystery, Emily installed security cameras in the apartment and changed all her digital passwords, from social networks to bank accounts. She felt safer for a few nights, but the messages kept coming. "Do you think these cameras are going to stop me?" This time, she went to the police. The officers took the case seriously and promised to investigate the unknown number. That night, Emily decided to stay up late reviewing the videos from the cameras. Everything seemed normal until she noticed something disturbing in a recording from the previous morning. A hooded figure slowly leaving her room and disappearing through the front door. She froze as she realized that she hadn't been alone that night. Someone really had been inside her house while she slept. Despair overtook her. How had this person managed to get in without leaving a trace? And why? The messages began to change tone. "You can't run away," or "I know where you are at all times." The tension was unbearable. Emily began to avoid sleeping at night and spent hours awake in the living room with all the lights on. But this only seemed to fuel the stalker's game. A new message arrived early one morning. "Lights on won't save you." It was then that she noticed something even more disturbing. Objects in her house were being subtly moved around. Books out of order on the bookshelf, clothes folded differently. Even her favorite mug appeared in a place where she would never leave it. It was as if the intruder wanted to show that he had total control over her life. One particularly quiet night was interrupted by footsteps in the corridor outside the apartment. Her heart raced again. He picked up the knife he kept beside his bed and stood still, waiting for any sign of invasion. The footsteps stopped right in front of her door. Suddenly, his phone vibrated with a new message. "I'm here." Before she could react, someone started banging on the door with increasing force. Emily screamed for help as she called the police. When officers arrived minutes later, which seemed like hours to her, they found only deep marks on the door and a note stuck to it with tape. "See you soon." The police reinforced security in the building and promised to patrol the area regularly. But Emily knew that this wasn't enough to make her feel safe again. Determined to find answers, she started investigating on her own. She discovered that the unknown number had been used in several different cities over the last few years, always associated with reports similar to hers, people stalked by mysterious messages until they disappeared without a trace. Emily left the apartment that same night and never returned. She moved to London under another name and avoids sharing personal information online or with strangers as much as possible. But sometimes, in the silence of the night in her new home, she still feels as if she's being watched, as if that voice in the dark has never really gone away. 2. The Stranger on the Train. London, a vibrant and frenetic city where millions of people cross paths every day without exchanging a word. For Thomas Carter, a 34-year-old financial analyst, the routine was always the same. Wake up at 6:30 a.m., have a quick coffee, and catch the 7:15 a.m. train from Clapham Junction station to the city centre. He liked the predictability of his life. On the train, he always chose the same seat near the window, put on his headphones, and read the news on his cell phone while the world went by outside. Everything seemed normal until he began to notice something strange. There was a man who always took the same train and, disturbingly, seemed to be paying attention to him. At first, Thomas thought it was a coincidence. After all, many passengers had fixed schedules and similar routines. But as the days went by, he noticed something disturbing. The man was not only looking at him, but also writing something in a notebook as he watched him. The stranger was discreet, but Thomas began to feel uncomfortable. He was about 40 years old, wore thick glasses and simple clothes, always a worn brown jacket and a black backpack. The notebook was small and battered, and the man would often put his head down to write something just after looking at Thomas. In the third week of this disturbing routine, Thomas decided to test whether he was just imagining things. He changed carriages at the last minute before the train left. To his surprise, or perhaps horror, the man appeared again in the same carriage a few minutes later and sat down a few meters away from him. The discomfort turned into a knot in his stomach. That night, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the man on the train. Who was he? Why did he seem so interested in him? He decided to share the situation with his work colleague and close friend, Claire. She laughed at first, suggesting that perhaps he was just someone with a platonic crush or a peculiar habit. But when Thomas mentioned the notebook and the constant stares, she got serious. "You should confront him," Claire suggested, "or at least try to find out what he's writing." The next day, Thomas got on the train, determined to face up to the situation. When he saw the man again, sitting in the same seat as usual, he felt his heart race. But before he could say anything, the stranger got up at the next station and disappeared into the crowd. Thomas tried to carry on as normal for the next few days, but the man's presence continued to disturb him. Then, something even more disturbing happened. He began to see him outside the train. On Friday evening, while shopping in the supermarket near his home, Thomas saw a familiar figure in the dairy aisle. It was him, the man with the notebook. This time, there was no doubt. The stranger looked directly at him for a few seconds before turning away and disappearing between the shelves. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. He could no longer ignore it as a coincidence. He hurried out of the supermarket and looked over his shoulder all the way home. Over the next few days, the appearances became more frequent, almost as if the stranger was invading every aspect of his life. He turned up at the gym where Thomas trained on Saturday mornings. He was seen standing on the corner of the street where he lived, even at a cafe where Thomas used to work remotely sometimes. Paranoia took hold of him. He started avoiding public places and even temporarily changed his route to work, taking the bus instead of the usual train. But that didn't help. One rainy morning, while waiting for the bus under a crowded awning, he saw the man standing across the street with his notebook in his hand. Determined to put an end to it once and for all, Thomas decided to confront him at the next opportunity. The following Monday, he returned to the 7:15 train with renewed determination. When he saw the stranger enter the carriage and sit down next to him, as he always did, Thomas stood up abruptly and marched over to him. "Who are you and why are you following me?" he asked loudly, attracting curious looks from the other passengers. The man looked surprised for a moment before slowly closing his notebook and looking at Thomas with a calm, almost cold expression. "I'm not following you," he replied in a low, controlled tone. "I'm studying you." "Studying? What does that mean?" demanded Thomas. The stranger hesitated for a moment before replying, "You're part of an experiment." Before Thomas could press him further or better understand that enigmatic answer, the man stood up quickly as soon as the train stopped at the next station and disappeared into the crowd before he could be followed. Thomas stood there for several minutes while he tried to process those words. "You are part of an experiment." What did that mean? Who was behind it? And why him? Over the next few days, Thomas tried to find answers. He reported the man's appearances to the police and even hired a private investigator to track down any information about him. But nothing was found. No record of the stranger on the station's cameras or in the places where he had been seen before. Gradually, the apparitions stopped as suddenly as they had started, but Thomas was never able to return to normality completely. To this day, he avoids crowded trains or predictable routines, always looking over his shoulder, fearing that the stranger with his notebook will reappear to continue the experiment. 3. The bedroom window. It was early fall in Prague, and the nights were starting to get colder. The Charles University campus, with its Gothic architecture and cobbled streets, was the perfect setting for the academic dreams of Sophie Novak, a 21-year-old literature student. She had just moved into the student dormitory, an old 5-story building in a quiet area of the city. Her room was small but cozy, with a large window that offered a breathtaking view of the city's red roofs and towers. Sophie liked to study at night, when the silence took over the building and only the distant sound of the city filled the air. It was her favorite time of the day, sitting at her desk by the window with a cup of hot tea and her books spread out. But on one of those quiet evenings, something disturbing happened. While revising notes for an assignment, Sophie felt an inexplicable chill. It was as if she was being watched. She looked out of the window and saw nothing but darkness. Maybe it was just her imagination, she thought, but the feeling persisted. The following evening, while reading a book in the dim light of the lamp, something caught her eye. In the reflection of the glass, she saw a quick movement, as if someone was outside. She immediately turned and looked at the window. Nothing, just darkness and the distant lights of the city. Trying to shake off her paranoia, Sophie closed the curtains and went back to work. But she couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that seemed to grow by the minute. Before going to sleep, she decided to check the window again. When she opened the curtains, her heart almost stopped. There were handprints on the outside of the glass. She was paralyzed for a few seconds, trying to process what she was seeing. How was that possible? Her room was on the 5th floor. Who could have reached that height? Shivering, she took pictures of the marks with her cell phone before closing them again and locking the window firmly. The next morning, Sophie showed the photos to her friends in the dormitory. Some laughed nervously, suggesting that perhaps it was just a joke or some kind of illusion caused by the condensation on the glass. But others were just as uneasy. "You should tell the building management," suggested Clara, her roommate. Sophie took the advice and reported the incident to the dorm supervisor. He promised to check the security cameras and reinforce security in the building, but seemed skeptical about the whole situation. Over the next few days, Sophie tried to go about her routine as normal, but the nights became increasingly difficult. Even with the curtains closed, she felt as if something, or someone, was outside. And then the notes started. The first time she found one, it was on her desk when she returned from her afternoon classes. It was a small piece of paper folded in half with a handwritten message. "You are beautiful when you concentrate." The handwriting was irregular and almost childish. Her blood ran cold. How had that note ended up there? She was sure she had locked the room before she left in the morning. Did someone have a copy of the key? Or worse, was the intruder breaking in while she was asleep? Sophie took the note to the dorm supervisor again, but he seemed more concerned with calming her down than seriously investigating the case. "It's probably just some student trying to get your attention," he said with a forced smile. "I'll reinforce the warnings about privacy." But Sophie knew it was more serious than a simple joke. That night, she stacked furniture against the door as a makeshift barrier before going to sleep. Even so, she had trouble falling asleep. When she finally managed to rest for a few hours, she woke up abruptly to hear a strange sound, as if something was scratching the window pane. Her heart racing, she slowly got up and opened the curtains just enough to peek outside. There was nothing but the usual darkness. But when she looked down towards the street, she saw something that made her stomach turn. A figure standing on the sidewalk looking directly at her window. The person was dressed in dark clothes and wore a hood that hid part of their face. Even so, Sophie felt as if those piercing eyes were fixed on her. She quickly closed the curtains and backed up against the opposite wall. The next morning she found another note, this time inside her favorite book on the desk. "I like it when you read before bed." This meant that whoever it was not only knew her nocturnal habits, but also went through her personal belongings while she wasn't around. Desperate for answers and security, Sophie decided to install a hidden camera in her bedroom to monitor any activity while she was away or asleep. The first night after installing the camera, nothing happened, at least nothing visible to her eyes. But when she reviewed the recordings the next morning, she was horrified to see images of a man entering her room at around 3 a.m., wearing black gloves and carrying a small flashlight. He calmly walked over to her desk, left a note on the books, and then approached the bed where she was sleeping soundly for a few seconds before quietly slipping out of the door. Sophie took the images to the police immediately. The authorities launched an investigation and discovered that the man had been entering the building via an external ladder used by staff for maintenance, something that explained the marks on the window too. Although he was never identified or caught, Sophie was moved to another dormitory in another area of the city under temporary police protection. Nowadays, even years after that terrifying incident, Sophie still avoids open windows at night and never leaves her doors unlocked, because she knows that some presences are too silent to be noticed until it's too late. If you've enjoyed the story so far, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps my work and motivates me to bring you even more chilling content. It costs nothing and makes all the difference. 4. The Loyal Customer. It was an ordinary morning in Paris. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the small cafe in the Montmartre district, where Camille had been working as a barista for 2 years. She loved the cozy atmosphere of the place, with its worn wooden tables, vintage paintings on the walls, and the soft light coming in through the windows. It was the kind of place that attracted tourists and locals alike, creating a vibrant mix of people. Among the regulars, there was one man who always caught Camille's eye. He was discreet but assiduous. Every morning at 8:30 sharp, he would enter the cafe, order a cappuccino, and sit down at the same table by the window. He never spoke much more than necessary to take her order, but his eyes seemed to be too observant, attentive to her every move. At first, Camille didn't take much notice. Working in a cafe meant dealing with all kinds of people, and regular customers were commonplace. But over time, she began to notice something strange about this man. He seemed to know more about her than he should. One morning, while preparing his usual cappuccino, he casually remarked, "I hope you've recovered from the flu. It must have been hard working sick last week." Camille paused for a moment, surprised. She had indeed come down with the flu recently, but she didn't remember mentioning it to anyone in the cafe. "How do you know that?" she asked, trying to sound relaxed. He smiled slightly and replied, "Oh, you looked a bit down last week. I just imagined it." Camille forced a smile and handed over the order, but felt a shiver run down her spine. From that day on, she began to pay more attention to him. He never seemed to take his eyes off her while he was in the cafe, and always made subtle comments about things she didn't remember sharing. A few weeks later, Camille was talking to her co-worker about a party she was planning to attend at the weekend. It was a small event, organized by close friends at a local bar. To her surprise and discomfort, the client turned up at the party that evening. "Camille, what a coincidence to find you here," he said with a broad smile. She was speechless for a few seconds before replying, "Yes, coincidence." But inside she felt uneasy. How did he know about the party? Was he listening in on her conversations at work? From then on, his appearances outside the cafe became more frequent. He started showing up in places she used to go regularly, the market near her house, the park where she ran on Sundays, and even the bookstore where she liked to spend her afternoons off. Camille tried to ignore the situation and maintain her normal routine, but this became impossible when he turned up on a trip she took to get away from him. At the beginning of spring, she decided to visit Lyon to spend a few days away from the hustle and bustle of Paris and try to relax. But as she strolled through a busy square in the city center, she saw a familiar figure in the distance. It was him. Her heart raced as he approached with that calm, familiar smile. "What a surprise to find you here," he said, as if it were completely coincidental. Camille couldn't hide her frustration this time. "This is no coincidence. How did you know I'd be here?" He shrugged and replied, "I think we have similar tastes." She hurried off without saying another word, and spent the rest of the trip constantly looking over her shoulder. When she got back to Paris, she decided to confront him directly in the cafe. The next morning, as soon as he entered and placed his usual order, Camille crossed her arms and faced him firmly. "Why are you following me?" she asked bluntly. He looked surprised for a moment before replying calmly, "I just enjoy your work and your company." "That's not normal," she retorted. "You show up where I am uninvited. That's scary." The man kept the smile on his face, but his eyes seemed colder now. "I just want to be close to you," he said in a low tone before grabbing his cappuccino and leaving the cafe without looking back. Camille decided to take the case to the police after that. She reported all the strange encounters and provided information about the cafe's regular customer. But as he had never made any direct threats or committed an obvious crime, the authorities said they couldn't do much more than register the case. Determined to protect herself, Camille began to change her habits. She avoided predictable places, switched shifts at work to different hours, and even installed cameras in her small apartment to ensure her safety. For a few weeks, it seemed that things were returning to normal, until she found something disturbing in her mailbox one morning. A photo of her taken inside the cafe while she was at work, accompanied by a handwritten message: "You will never be alone." Fear seized her again. Camille resigned from the cafe that same week and moved to another part of the city without telling anyone apart from her closest friends. Although she never saw the man again after that, she lived for years looking over his shoulder, always with the unsettling feeling that he was still watching her from a distance. Because some presences persist even when they disappear from view, like silent shadows that never really leave us alone. 5. The Call of the Forest. He seemed perfect for an adventure. A group of 5 friends, Ingrid, Lars, Sophia, Eric and Hannah, decided to explore the Nordmarka forest, a vast area of untouched nature on the outskirts of Oslo. Ingrid, the most adventurous of the group, had planned the route carefully, a 2-day hike with camping in the middle. Everyone was excited to escape the hustle and bustle of the city and reconnect with nature. The forest was stunning. Tall, dense trees formed a green roof that filtered the sunlight, creating an almost magical atmosphere. The sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind were the only noises that broke the deep silence. However, as they advanced along the trail, a strange sensation began to take hold of the group, as if they were being watched. "Did you feel that?" asked Sophia in a low voice as she looked over her shoulder. "Felt what?" replied Eric, trying to sound nonchalant. "As if someone was following us." Lars laughed to ease the tension. "It's just your imagination. We're in the middle of the forest. Who would be here apart from us?" But Ingrid frowned. She also felt something strange, although she didn't want to alarm the others. She decided to ignore it and continue leading the group along the trail. By late afternoon, when they arrived at the planned campsite, the feeling of unease seemed to have subsided. They set up their tents, lit a fire, and started cooking. Laughter and conversation soon filled the space, dispelling any remnants of fear. But then Eric noticed something unusual, a strange mark on a tree near the camp. It was a rudimentary symbol carved into the bark, a circle with crossed lines in the center. "Someone's been here before," he said, pointing to the symbol. "Probably just another group of hikers," suggested Hannah, trying to downplay the situation. "Or maybe it's some kind of territorial marking," joked Lars with a nervous smile. Ingrid examined the symbol more closely. It didn't look like something done by chance. There was precision in the cuts, as if it had been made with deliberate intent. But she decided not to comment on her thoughts so as not to frighten her friends. That night, while everyone was asleep in their tents, Ingrid woke up to a distant sound, light footsteps on the dry leaves. She lay still for a few seconds, trying to discern whether it was just her imagination or something real. She grabbed her flashlight and quietly left the tent. The dim light illuminated the trees around the camp, but revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Just as she was about to return to the tent, she noticed something hanging from a nearby branch, a red scarf that belonged to Sophia. Ingrid took the scarf with trembling hands and hurried back to wake the others. "Someone's been here," she said as she showed them the scarf. Sophia turned pale as she recognized the object. "I left this in my backpack before I went to sleep." The group remained silent for a few seconds as they assimilated what this meant. They were not alone in the forest. The next morning, they decided to cut their trip short and head back to the city. But as they followed the trail back, they began to find more disturbing signs. Marks similar to those from the night before on various trees along the way, and other personal objects hanging from the branches. Lars' cap, Eric's water bottle, and even one of Hannah's extra shoes. Panic began to grip the group. Whoever was doing this seemed to be toying with them, showing that they had access to their things without being seen. "This isn't normal," said Lars as he looked around nervously. "We need to get out of here now." But the further they walked, the more lost they seemed to be. The trail they had followed the day before looked different now, as if someone had altered the natural landmarks to confuse them. The GPS on Ingrid's cell phone wasn't working due to the lack of signal in the dense forest. Then came the sound, a long, high-pitched whistle that echoed through the trees. Everyone stopped immediately and looked at each other with wide eyes. "Who's there?" shouted Eric towards the source of the sound. There was no answer, just absolute silence that seemed even more oppressive after the whistle. They decided to keep walking until they found some sign of civilization, or at least got out of the dense forest. But the whistling continued to echo at irregular intervals, always coming from different directions, as if whoever it was deliberately surrounding them. At dusk, they finally spotted an abandoned hut in the middle of the forest. Although hesitant to enter, they decided to use the place as a temporary shelter until dawn again. Inside the hut, there were clear signs of recent occupation: leftover food in open cans, dirty blankets strewn across the floor, and more symbols carved into the walls inside. The same crossed circles they had seen in the trees before. It was then that they noticed something even more disturbing. On one of the walls, there were photos of them taken during their hike. Clearly recent images showing them on the trail without them realizing they were being photographed. Panic reached its peak at that moment. They decided to abandon everything, backpacks, equipment, and run through the forest in the desperate hope of finding help before it was too late. When they finally emerged from the forest at dawn, they were physically and emotionally exhausted. They never found out who or what was following them on that fateful walk. But they all knew that they would never return to Nordmarka Forest again, because some presences don't need to be seen to be felt, and certain places hold secrets that should never be unlocked. 6. The Silent Neighbor. It was the beginning of a new phase for Clara and Daniel. After years of planning, they had finally managed to rent an apartment in a quiet neighborhood of Vienna, Austria. The building was old but well-maintained, with architectural details that reflected the city's history. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, with windows that offered a lovely view of a tree-lined square. For the young couple, it was the perfect place to start their new life together. For the first week, everything seemed to go smoothly. The neighbors were polite, albeit reserved, and the building was quiet, just what Clara and Daniel were looking for. However, they soon noticed something peculiar about their downstairs neighbor. The man, who appeared to be in his 50s, was reclusive and never exchanged more than a nod when they passed him in the hallway or on the stairs. He lived alone and was rarely seen outside his apartment, but there was something in his gaze, a mixture of curiosity and intensity that made Clara uncomfortable. "He's just a lonely guy," said Daniel when Clara mentioned his restlessness. "There's nothing wrong with that." Clara tried to ignore the strange feeling and carry on with her routine. But then the incidents began. One evening, as Clara walked around the apartment barefoot, she heard a sound coming from downstairs, as if someone was following in her footsteps. Every movement she made seemed to be echoed by the neighbor below. When she stopped, the sound also ceased. It was as if he was listening intently to her every move. "Did you hear that?" Clara asked Daniel, who was sitting on the sofa watching TV. "What? I didn't hear anything," he replied distractedly. But Clara knew she wasn't imagining things. The following night, she decided to test her theory. She walked deliberately across the room and stopped suddenly. The sound of footsteps below also stopped at the same moment. From that moment on, she began to feel constantly watched, even inside her own apartment. And then the gifts came. The morning after the footstep test, Clara found a small box left on the apartment doorstep. Inside was a dried flower carefully pressed between two sheets of paper. There was no note or explanation. "Maybe it's just a friendly gesture," suggested Daniel when Clara showed it to him. "But why would they leave it without saying anything?" she retorted, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Over the next few days, other items began to appear. An old photograph of an unknown woman, a small cracked mirror, and even an old book with pages marked with passages about obsessive love. Each object seemed more disturbing than the last. Clara began to avoid being alone in the apartment during the day and started locking all the doors and windows at night. But the incidents continued. One night, while they were asleep, they were woken up by a loud sound coming from the front door, as if someone was trying to turn the handle. Daniel ran to check, but found no one in the hallway. However, there was another present, an antique porcelain doll with painted eyes that seemed to be looking directly at Clara. "This is way out of line," said Daniel, as he threw the doll in the trash. "Let's talk to the landlord tomorrow." The next day, they went to the landlord's office to report the incidents and express their suspicions about their downstairs neighbor. The landlord listened patiently before answering with a cautious tone. "Mr. Weber, he's peculiar, but he's never caused any trouble before. He's lived here for over 20 years. "Well, he's causing trouble now," insisted Daniel. "Those presents are disturbing." The landlord promised to talk to Weber and check out the situation. That night, for the first time in weeks, everything seemed quiet. No strange sounds coming from downstairs, no presence on the doorstep in the morning. Clara began to believe that perhaps things were returning to normal until she found something terrifying. While cleaning her room that afternoon, she noticed something strange on one of the walls next to her bed. Small, almost imperceptible holes lined up vertically in the wallpaper. Taking a flashlight to investigate more closely, she discovered that they were deliberately made holes, as if someone had drilled into the ceiling downstairs to look through them. His heart raced as he called Daniel over to show him his discovery. "This is insane," he said, as he examined the holes carefully. "He's spying on us." Wasting no time, they called the police and reported everything, from the gifts to the strange sounds, and now the holes in the bedroom floor. The police went to Weber's apartment to question him. When they knocked on his door, there was initially no answer, but after insisting for several minutes, Weber finally opened the door with a calm and disconcerting smile. Inside his apartment, they found something even more disturbing. Walls covered in secretly taken photos of Clara at different times, walking around the building, sitting on the balcony, and even sleeping through holes in the ceiling. Weber was taken into custody that night on charges of invasion of privacy and stalking. Although he never explained his actions or intentions clearly, it was clear that his obsession with Clara had crossed all acceptable boundaries. After the incident, Clara and Daniel immediately decided to move to another neighborhood far away. Although they tried to move on with their lives, Clara could never forget the cold, obsessive eyes of her silent neighbor, nor the constant feeling that she was being watched, even when she was alone in her new home. Because some presences leave deep marks, not just on the walls or ceilings, but also in the memories of those who have faced them directly. 7. The fake profile. Mia's life seemed perfect in the eyes of her thousands of followers on social media. At 26, she had achieved digital influencer status in London, sharing her daily life with posts about fashion, travel, and lifestyle. Her carefully edited photos and inspiring captions attracted brands and fans who admired her seemingly flawless life. But behind the camera lens, Mia knew that constant exposure had its price. It all started subtly. A direct message on her Instagram caught her eye. It was from a newly created profile, with a generic photo and no followers. The message read, "I know where you were last night." Mia laughed nervously and ignored it, thinking it was just a random troll trying to get attention. After all, strange messages weren't unusual for someone with her online visibility. But the messages continued. The same profile sent another the next day. "You looked so pretty in the cafe around the corner this morning." This time, Mia felt uneasy. She had indeed gone to a cafe that morning, but she hadn't posted anything about it. How could anyone know? Deciding to ignore the annoyance, she blocked the profile and carried on with her routine. However, new profiles began to appear, all with generic names and fake photos, sending similar or even more personal messages. One of them mentioned the name of the restaurant where she would be dining that night before she had even left the house. Mia began to feel paranoid. Someone was clearly monitoring her movements in real time. She checked her recent posts to see if she had accidentally revealed anything, but found nothing to explain how the stalker knew so much about her life. The situation got worse when the stalker started interacting with her followers. Using fake profiles, he sent messages to Mia's fans, pretending to be a close friend or even Mia herself. In some messages, the stalker shared personal information about her, such as the address of the building where she lived or details about her family. Mia realized how serious the situation was when a concerned follower sent a screenshot of a conversation with one of the fake profiles. In the message, the stalker said, "I'm organizing a surprise meeting for Mia's most dedicated fans. Come to this address at 8 p.m. The address was real. It was the building where Mia lived. That evening, 3 people showed up at the door of her building, expecting the surprise. Fortunately, the doorman prevented them from entering and explained that there was no event going on. Frightened and feeling vulnerable, Mia decided to seek help. She hired a company specializing in digital security to investigate the fake profiles and protect her online accounts. They discovered that the stalker used VPNs to mask his location and created new profiles every day to avoid being traced. Meanwhile, in real life, things got even more dangerous. One morning, while out jogging in the park near her apartment, Mia realized she was being followed by a man wearing a hoodie. He kept enough distance so as not to look suspicious, but every time she looked back, he was there. Mia tried to lose him by abruptly changing her route and entering busy streets. When she finally returned home, she found another fake profile sending a message. "You run fast, but not fast enough." The tension reached its peak when the stalker managed to manipulate her personal information to create dangerous situations. He made reservations at expensive restaurants using her name and left outstanding debts. He sent flowers to her work with disturbing messages like, "You're mine now." And he even tried to cancel important contracts Mia had with partner brands. Desperate, Mia decided to involve the police. Although the authorities took the case seriously, tracking down someone so digitally savvy proved to be a huge challenge. In the meantime, she had to completely change her approach on social media. She stopped sharing her location in real time and drastically limited the personal information she published. But the stalker always seemed to be one step ahead. One evening, while reviewing contracts at home, he heard a sound coming from the apartment's balcony, something like light footsteps on the wooden floor outside the glass door. Her heart raced as she slowly approached to check. When she opened the balcony curtains with trembling hands, she found a single red rose left there, along with a handwritten note. "You can try to hide, but I'll always know where you are." The police were called immediately and reinforced security in her building. But even so, Mia knew she wasn't safe as long as that stalker remained on the loose. Determined to regain control over her life, she decided to take a drastic step. She took a leave of absence from social media and temporarily moved to another city without telling anyone other than her closest friends and trusted family members. Although it was hard to give up everything she had worked so hard for, her career as an influencer, Mia knew that her safety was more important than anything else. Months later, when she finally returned to social media under a new name and with strict privacy measures in place, she still felt the effects of the trauma caused by the stalker. Because living under the constant eye of someone obsessive is like being trapped in an invisible cage, where every move is monitored and every moment seems to be at someone else's mercy. And although she never found out who was behind the fake profiles or the dangerous manipulations in real life, Mia learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes the constant connection to the digital world can open doors to those who shouldn't have access to our lives, doors that can be difficult to close again. And those were the 7 horror stories involving stalkers and stalking. So, what did you think? Which of these stories gave you the most chills? Tell us in the comments. If you liked this video, don't forget to like it. It really helps the channel to keep bringing you content like this. And if you're not subscribed yet, take the opportunity to subscribe so you don't miss out on the next videos. Until next time, and take care.